to the next item of business. This is a debate on motion 24292 in the name of Ruth Davidson on a motion of no confidence. I would encourage all members who wish to speak in this debate to press their request to speak buttons, and members should note that I will call the question on the motion immediately following the conclusion of the debate. Can I call Ruth Davidson?
Thank you. Presiding Officer, we're here today because a former First Minister was accused of sexually harassing members of staff in the government that he was there not only to lead but to serve. We're here because the hastily changed policy designed to protect staff from such actions was not fit for purpose and was implemented in an unfair and unlawful way. We are here because the Scottish Government, when subject to judicial review of the cluster burúch that had occurred, sought to frustrate the court, embarrassed their own lawyers and attempted to defend the indefensible, costing the taxpayer over £500,000 in the process. Nobody comes out of this well, apart from the original complainants and the external counsel to the Scottish Government. And nobody has taken responsibility for the multiple failings at every level which occurred. Getting to today has been a process years in the making. And let's remember the promises that were made. I now intend fully as the First Minister to respect the work of the various investigations that have been established. The words of Nicola Sturgeon spoken from the place in which she is now sitting on the 17th of January 2019. And I took her at her word. A committee of the Scottish Parliament had been established to consider and report on the actions of the First Minister, of government officials and of special advisers over the botched investigation. That committee would take evidence, deliberate and deliver a judgment. Indeed, the First Minister demanded of members of this chamber the same high standards that she claimed for herself. She said, "It strikes me that people cannot call for inquiries and then refuse to respect the work of those inquiries. I will respect the work of those inquiries, and the question is, will others across the chamber?" It was a fundamental question, to which at the time there seemed a pretty self-evident answer. What member of this Parliament would not respect and accept the verdict of a committee of this Parliament established to investigate such serious matters? But now the verdict is in, and we have our answer to that fundamental question. And those who have traduced the committee, who have rubbished its work, who have thrown mud at its members, who have made baseless claims regarding its outcomes, and have disrespected its conclusions, are the members that are sitting behind the First Minister and who are catcalling from a sedentary position at the moment.
Order, please.
Yesterday, we publicly accepted the Hamilton report. For days, others have rejected the committees. And we note that Hamilton was crystal clear that the basis of this vote of no confidence, whether the First Minister misled this Parliament or not, is a decision for this Parliament and not for him. So let's look at the committee's conclusions. In its 192 pages, the report directly concludes that the First Minister misled the Parliamentary Committee regarding her initial meeting with Alex Salmond in her house in April 2018. We already know that her original statement, that this meeting was the first that she had heard of any such complaints, was also misleading. And months after she falsely stated that to Parliament, she was forced to correct the record. The committee also concluded that the catastrophic failure to disclose documents through the judicial review process was the reason for the high awarding of costs and the wasting of taxpayers' money, saying those responsible should be held accountable. Similar to the judicial review, the committee was directly thwarted in its attempts to gather evidence, and its verdict was scalding. This is an unacceptable position for a parliamentary committee to find itself in when trying to scrutinise the government, particularly when both the First Minister and the Permanent Secretary stated that there would be full cooperation with the inquiry, and how hollow that full cooperation pledge now looks. But the most difficult bit to read of this whole report for all of us, and I expect for the First Minister too, are the words of the original complainers themselves, who were badly let down, who talked of working in a culture where bad behaviour was endemic and such behaviour was permitted and a blind eye was turned to it. A charge that was substantiated by the civil service union, the FDA, who said that its members, working for the Scottish Government, operated in a culture of fear and that issues are not historical, they are current. No matter what your political colours, it should shame us all that working for your country's government, which should be a matter of pride, is actually a test of strength because of unacceptable behaviour and blind eyes being turned. And on the subject of behaviour, I want to put on record that I believe the leaking of this report's findings last week was both damaging and wrong, and I, along with my party, will support any investigation into that wrongdoing. Presiding Officer, the First Minister proclaimed her respect for the work of this Parliament's Committee of Inquiry, right up until the moment it became clear that the outcome would not suit her. Then her respect for it vanished. And I don't doubt that if this committee report had cleared her of wrongdoing, it would be held up as being the will of this Parliament. But a report which found her to have misled this Parliament is instead denounced as an unprincipled hatchet job. I've already said that I respect the Hamilton report's conclusions, but he publicly and specifically handed the question of whether the First Minister misled this Parliament back to the Parliament itself. And let's be clear about what the committee inquiry of this Parliament has found. After taking months of evidence from dozens of witnesses, even including the First Minister's 8 hours of testimony, after all of that evidence gathering and deliberation, the committee found that Nicola Sturgeon misled this Parliament. And nothing can erase that fact, however inconvenient it is to the First Minister and to her supporters. And let's remember that by misleading this Scottish Parliament, she misled the people of Scotland too. No First Minister who truly wanted to live up to the ideals of this Parliament should feel able to continue in post after having been judged guilty of misleading it. How can Parliament have confidence in the words of a First Minister whose words have been found to be false? The honourable thing would be to resign. Whether the First Minister has that sense of honour is now between her and her conscience. I move the motion in my name.
Thank you. And I call on the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon.
Presiding Officer, wisdom, justice, compassion, integrity. Those are the values inscribed in our mace, and each and every single one of us has a duty to uphold them. So before I address my position, let me say this. There are some in this chamber who decided before a single word of evidence had been heard that I was guilty in relation to the handling of complaints against the former First Minister. The only question was what they would choose to find me guilty of. In recent months, I've faced accusations of conspiracy against, collusion with and cover-up on behalf of Alex Salmond. None of that is supported by evidence because none of that is true. But for some, as I think this Tory motion makes clear, getting to the facts, learning lessons and helping ensure that women are not let down in future were always secondary considerations to the desperate attempt to claim my political scalp. Nevertheless, Presiding Officer, the committee's work was important, and I give an assurance today that the Government will study its report closely and take its recommendations very seriously. The mistake made by the Government in the investigation of the complaints against Alex Salmond, albeit a mistake made in the course of trying to do the right thing, was serious, as were the consequences of it. And once again, I want to apologise unreservedly to the women who were let down as a result of that. It will be a priority of mine for as long as I am First Minister to ensure that lessons are learned and that trust is re-established so that anyone in future who considers that they have suffered sexual harassment has the confidence to come forward and know that their concerns will be listened to and addressed. Turning now, Presiding Officer, to my own position. As I said in evidence to the committee, I may not have got everything right in my handling of this situation. The situation I was confronted with was extremely difficult, politically certainly, but also personally. I accept and respect that some people faced with the same situation may have made different decisions. But I am clear in my mind that I acted appropriately and that I made the right judgments overall, and I reject entirely any suggestion of misleading this Parliament. Now, for me, being at peace with my own conscience, as I am on these matters, is a necessary condition of being able to continue as First Minister. But I know that that is not sufficient. No politician can be her own judge and jury. The public deserved independent verification that I had not breached the standards that I am expected to uphold. And yesterday they got that assurance from James Hamilton's report. Mr Hamilton considered all of the issues that were alleged to amount to a breach of the Ministerial Code, including the question of whether I misled Parliament, and this is what he concluded. I am of the opinion that the First Minister did not breach the provisions of the Ministerial Code in respect of any of these matters. In advance of yesterday's report, all parties spoke of the need to respect Mr Hamilton's conclusions. Indeed, the report of the committee itself says this: James Hamilton's report is the most appropriate place to address the question of whether or not the First Minister has breached the ministerial code. Presiding Officer, let me be clear about this. Had Mr Hamilton's report gone the other way, I would have accepted it. Had he found that I had breached the code in anything other than the most technical and immaterial of ways, I would have been standing here right now tendering my resignation. Because the integrity of the office I am so privileged to hold really does matter to me. The office of First Minister is more important than any temporary incumbent of it. But given that I have been cleared by that independent report of any breach of the ministerial code, then my message to all those, especially to the Conservatives, who now, despite Ruth Davidson's protestations, refuse to accept Mr Hamilton's conclusions, is this. If you think you can bully me out of office, you are mistaken and you misjudge me. If you want to remove me as First Minister, do it in an election. Of course, if today's desperate political stunt proves anything, it is that you have no confidence whatsoever in your ability to do so because you have nothing positive to offer the Scottish people. Presiding Officer, the last year has been exhausting for everyone. My experience of it is as nothing compared to those who have lost loved ones, suffered illness or watched businesses go to the wall. But I have given my all every single day trying to lead us through this ordeal. I don't mind admitting that the intensity and the gravity of decision-making has taken its toll. The Alex Salmond saga and the assault on my character that it has entailed has certainly not helped. But this country needs strong, experienced and positive leadership as we continue to navigate our way through and out of this crisis. And, Presiding Officer, that is what I offer. Which takes me to my final and to my most fundamental point. Tomorrow, this parliamentary term reaches its conclusion, perhaps not a moment too soon. The toxic atmosphere that has infected this chamber in recent months will give way, I hope, to the fresh air of an election. And I hope that the fresh air will bring with it a rigorous and positive debate, not just about personalities, but about the kind of country we want to be, about how we rebuild from this pandemic and create a fairer, more prosperous Scotland. It is now time, Presiding Officer, for the country to decide. The confidence of this Parliament matters. Of course it does. But it is the confidence of the people of Scotland that matters most. And that, the confidence of the people, is what I will seek to demonstrate and seek to win in the weeks that lie ahead.
Thank you. Can I call on Anas Sarwar?
Presiding Officer, earlier today we held a minute's silence on the steps outside this chamber to remember all those who have lost their lives over the past year and all those grieving the loss of a loved one. On this, the penultimate day before the Parliament reaches the end of its 5-year term, I would much rather we were reflecting on the impact of this dreadful pandemic and debating what we need to do to ensure our country recovers in the years ahead. Instead, we are confronted by a litany of government failings which led to 2 women being so badly let down, and a Tory party that cares not about the principles but about the politics. A harassment policy failed. 2 women were let down. It has shaken trust in the system and risks discouraging victims to come forward. It has called into question the integrity of government. It has undermined the principles of transparency and accountability. It has seen a misuse of public money. There are huge failures and big questions to be answered. There are no winners in this debate. Not the SNP. The spectacle of using a harassment inquiry as a recruiting tool was grotesque. And the Tories, in the face of all these failures, playing politics, interested only in getting a scalp. They announced they would bring a vote of no confidence before the First Minister had even given evidence to the committee. They lodged this motion on the 4th of March, before the Hamilton inquiry or the committee inquiry had concluded. Seriously? On one side, a litany of failings from a government that let down 2 women. On the other side, an opposition guilty of playing grubby party politics on an issue as serious as sexual harassment. This is a day of shame for our Parliament. Scotland deserves a better government, and it deserves a better opposition. From the outset, I have made it clear that we would not prejudice the outcome of the inquiries, that we would remove party and personality. I accept the conclusion of the report published yesterday, but I also accept the conclusions of the cross-party report published today by a committee of this Parliament, which highlights a catalogue of errors. And yet still nobody has taken responsibility for the catastrophic failings by this government. There are still serious questions for the Permanent Secretary and for the First Minister too, because the buck ultimately stops with her. It cheapens this Parliament to have the government attacking the work of the committee. The SNP's tactics risk calling into question the very verdict of every committee of this Parliament ever. Members have spent months scrutinising and investigating in an attempt to get to the truth, often in the face of obstruction from the government. There are huge challenges ahead for our country, but I tell you, Presiding Officer, we can't come back to a Parliament like this after the 6th of May, using this chamber as a game designed to divide our country further. Earlier today, I lodged an amendment to this motion which recognised the gravity of the government's failures and demanded that someone takes responsibility, whilst also calling out the shameless blame-paying by the Conservatives. That amendment was rejected, which I regret. So, as happens far too often in Scottish politics, we are left once again with a binary choice. Do I have confidence in the way the First Minister, her team and senior members of the government have handled this matter? Do I have confidence in the government's record? We only need to see today the report around the attainment gap, what the First Minister said we should judge her record on, and their ability to focus on coming through a national recovery as we come through COVID? No, Presiding Officer, I do not. But on what I hope is their second last day as Scotland's main opposition party, I also have no confidence in a Tory party which today seeks to use this awful episode in our country's history in the futile and vain pursuit of a cheap political scalp, contradicting what they say here to what they say in a different Parliament elsewhere. We cannot support a motion which is designed not to deliver the kind of strong opposition they promised, but purely at dividing our country and our politics still further. A failing government on one hand, a game-playing opposition on the other. Our politics must be better than this. Our people deserve better than this. For the sake of the people of Scotland coming through COVID and with the huge challenge and task that faces us, we can't come back to this. Presiding Officer, Scotland deserves a better government and it deserves a better opposition.
Thank you. Can I call on Willie Rennie?
Scottish politics today does not look pretty. Talk of lynching, assassination, leaking the private evidence of complainants, tabling motions of no confidence before even all the evidence had been heard, attacking a committee because it does not agree with the First Minister, lauding the performance of Nicola Sturgeon because she talked to a committee for 8 hours, as if the show is more important than the facts, boasting about recruiting new members on the back of this tragedy. No one wins from this ugly episode, not the First Minister, not Douglas Ross, and certainly not Alex Salmond, who has been exposed for what he really is. Though we know who has been failed, the women who complained. When they stepped up, we were not there for them. In the committee report published today, one woman tells how she and her fellow complainer were dropped by the Scottish Government and left to swim. There are unresolved issues that I wish to explore today, so we would have voted for the amendment in the name of Anas Sarwar if it had been selected. The Conservatives have shown themselves as only interested in removing Nicola Sturgeon from office, rather than the facts of this terrible series of events. They have undermined the integrity of the independent investigator. Yet, even the most ardent SNP supporter must recognise that the women who complained were let down by the government and that £500,000 was wasted defending the indefensible in court. We know the government will win today because they have the unconditional support of the Greens. But this debate and vote cannot be the end. So in his summing up, I would like the Deputy First Minister to tell us where this goes from here. First, how does he explain why James Hamilton was unable to conclude whether the First Minister misled Parliament over whether she offered to help Alex Salmond when they met in her home? James Hamilton says it is up to the Parliament to determine whether it has been misled on this. We need an adequate explanation from the Deputy First Minister. Second, on the transfer of the name of a complainant to Alex Salmond's former Chief of Staff, James Hamilton believes that did happen. He says that version of events is credible. That is a terrible breach of confidentiality. Not only were they left to swim, but their identity was passed to a person that they were complaining about. What is now to happen to the person responsible? Third, the government made a serious error in defending the indefensible in the court case costing £500,000 and more. This is a colossal error that apparently no individual is responsible for. What will happen next? Finally, on the government's complaints process. Confidence is rock bottom now. No one has complained in the last 3 years. What will the government do to convince this Parliament and women that this process will change? The SNP is divided, has a terrible record of delivery over 14 years in government. And there are serious questions about how women were treated by this government. I would contest that they no longer should be in office. Even as the government wins today, the voters will have their say in 7 weeks. The country deserves a positive, progressive alternative that will put recovery first. But how we will vote today will be determined by what answers we receive from the Deputy First Minister as he sums up today.
Thank you. And can I call Patrick Harvey, who joins us remotely? Patrick Harvey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This situation began with an extremely serious issue, the mishandling of an investigation into sexual harassment allegations. And I honestly wish that everyone's focus had remained on that issue. But what we've seen since then has been the deliberate, systematic, and entirely cynical exploitation of that issue to suit motives which are all too apparent today. The media in Scotland and throughout the UK is awash with speculation about the Sturgeon Salmond psychodrama. The coverage of this is dominated by one question: what does this mean for the independence cause? When we should be asking what this means for the treatment of harassment or for the position of those who want to call it out. Sadly, we already know the answer to that question. Since the original committee leaks months ago, through multiple instances of MSPs on that committee prejudging the evidence, announcing their political motivations to the world, and then to the disgraceful betrayal of trust, the original complainers over the last weekend, what should have been a serious inquiry has descended into farce. I believe this is the deliberate choice of those who have nothing to offer the people of Scotland. They looked at the devolved institutions and saw a high level of public trust in them and could not bear it. And they set about trying to drag everything down to their level. They will fail. But as a direct result of their actions, the women who complained about sexual harassment in the first place had to put out a statement via Rape Crisis Scotland to complain about the violation of their trust. So here we are, In one hand, we have an independent report by someone with enough professionalism not to go hawking quotes to the press in advance. It clears the First Minister of any breach of the ministerial code. And in the other hand, we have a report by a committee of this Parliament whose members have prejudged the evidence, called for resignations before listening to it, betrayed the original complainants in the sexual harassment case, and leaked their own conclusions to the media. Their actions are a betrayal of the trust we all placed in them when we appointed this committee. Calling out this behaviour does not, as Anas Sarwar suggests, reflect on the rest of our Parliament. Our Parliament is better than this, but they have clearly destroyed the credibility of their own work and advertised their partisan motivations for all to see. And far worse than that, they have sent a chilling message to anyone else considering complaining about harassment by powerful men, that if they do so, their lives can be turned into tawdry political theatre for months or even years. The only resignations I have any interest in debating today are those of the committee members who have so systematically broken our rules, abused the trust of witnesses, and played childish games with the serious issue they were asked to examine. They are the ones who should be resigning today, and any political party that wants to come out of this episode with a shred of credibility will do whatever it takes to identify the culprits and ensure that they are not able to stand for re-election in 6 weeks' time. They have shown contempt for the serious issue of sexual harassment. They have shown contempt for their witnesses. They have shown contempt for the rules of this Parliament. And having failed in their attempt to drag Scottish politics down to their level, they should just go. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr Harvey. Can I call Alistair Allen, who joins us remotely? Alistair Allen.
Presiding Officer, James Hamilton's independent investigation has now finally reported. It has unambiguously cleared the First Minister of all the charges that she had breached the ministerial code. Those very accusations were, of course, what today's flimsy motion of no confidence was seemingly built on. And judging by what I've heard so far, they are the dead horse which the Tories look determined to flog. It is worth collectively reminding ourselves, though, that this whole unhappy story isn't ultimately about politics. It's not about the conspiracy theories that grip the political and media worlds and which at one fevered point encompassed everyone in Scotland from the First Minister to SNP staff, to the complainers, to the civil service, the prosecutors, and even, improbably enough, to the Lord Advocate. In case we forget, this is ultimately the much simpler, sadder story of two women, two real human beings who made complaints. The Scottish Government's own complaints procedures, as we all now know, completely failed them. So too, it gives me no pleasure to say, did some of the officials who were tasked with operating those procedures. For my many sins, Presiding Officer, I have served these last 2 years on this Parliament's Committee of Inquiry into the handling of those complaints. Like a number of other committee members, I decided many months ago not to give a breathless running commentary to the media about our evidence and private deliberations. And to say that our committee leaked like the Titanic would be to do a considerable injustice to Harland and Wolff. The Titanic only leaked the once. I can genuinely say that for me, the low point in my 14 years in this place was when I found out that someone on our committee had gone so far as to leak sensitive material purporting to be accounts of the two women, accounts which had in fact not been authorised by them for release. That, Presiding Officer, was in flagrant breach of every assurance the women had been given about the trust they could place in us. Now, some have said that such behaviour represents a challenge to the credibility of this Parliament. Well, like Patrick Harvey, I profoundly disagree with that assessment. I think it's simply a challenge to the credibility of some members. But it does, I am afraid, speak to the deep reserves of disfiguring political hatred which some people in this place apparently have for the First Minister. a hatred born, no doubt, of long political frustration, and which brings them to their confidence motion today. Presiding Officer, there were, of course, many things in the committee's report on which we all agreed, and I hope those findings will be useful to prevent people being failed again in future. The unevidenced insinuations about the First Minister, which were tacked on to the end of our report in the last day or two of our meetings, do not, I am afraid, fall into that category. In any case, Mr Hamilton's report demolishes the very basis for today's motion. The idea that the ministerial code was breached through failure to record meetings, the allegation that the First Minister may have attempted to influence the conduct of the investigation, or that she misled Parliament, or that she failed to comply with the law, are all rejected. So, Presiding Officer, as this Parliament draws to a close and this motion runs into the sands, what are the opposition left with? Their loathing aside, I mean. Well, they are left facing an election which it seems they have decided to make all about character. Presiding Officer, after this week, I wish them good luck with that one.
Thank you, Mr Allen. And we'll turn now to closing speeches. Jackie Baillie, to be followed by John Swinney. Jackie Baillie.
I am proud to have been a member of the Scottish Parliament since its inception, just like the Presiding Officer and the First Minister, a member of the class of '99. But never in my 22 years here have I seen or imagined anything quite like this. The fallout between the former First Minister and the current First Minister has laid bare the deep divisions in the SNP. It's laid bare the blurring of lines between the party and the government, and it has exposed the need for the Scottish Parliament, in my view, to have more powers to hold the government to account. I want to focus my comments on the committee report, but first, let me say that the result of this vote of no confidence is a foregone conclusion. I have to question the motivation of the Tories to have a vote of no confidence before James Hamilton had even reported, before they had seen the outcome of the committee's inquiry, is deeply irresponsible. The committee report published this morning details the catastrophic failings of the Scottish Government on a matter of the utmost seriousness and sensitivity. Despite the obstruction of the Scottish Government, and the obstruction was significant, the committee has managed to get beyond the veil of government secrecy. We must never forget, though, the two female civil servants who complained about harassment and who have been comprehensively failed by the Scottish Government. I welcome the First Minister's acknowledgement of this and apology for it. But 3 years on, no one has taken responsibility for this. There have been no resignations, no sackings, yet we all acknowledge that the failure was catastrophic. The harassment policy was rushed through without any specialist advice or input. The handling of complaints was fundamentally flawed, with the appointment of an investigating officer that was not independent from the process. And the person who had oversight of all of this, who was involved in every aspect of the procedure, was the Permanent Secretary, and she must bear much of the responsibility. The Scottish Government still does not have a functioning harassment policy, so it is essential that the recommendations of the Laura Dunlop report are carried through urgently, and it's essential that the recommendations of the committee, the majority of which were unanimous, are carried forward too. The committee also felt that the Scottish Government's determination to plough on, defending their position in the Court of Session when the prospects of success were minimal, was irresponsible and cost the taxpayer in excess of £500,000. A majority also believed that the First Minister misled the committee about whether she would intervene following her meeting with Alex Salmond on the 2nd of April. Now, I know that this has been painted as a partisan decision, but let me say to you, one independent member, one Labour member, 2 Tories and 1 Lib Dem agreed after hearing the evidence. That's not partisan. But 4 SNP members who voted together were never, despite what they may have heard, were never going to vote to criticise the First Minister. There remain many serious questions that need to be answered, that need to be answered about the First Minister's judgment, that need to be answered about the Scottish Government's handling of harassment complaints. But above all, we need to ensure that women coming forward to complain about harassment are not let down by the Scottish Government ever again.
And can I call John Swinney to be followed by Liz Smith? John Swinney.
Presiding Officer, it is my privilege to close this debate for the Government and to encourage Parliament to reject this baseless motion from the Conservatives. At the heart of this debate, as many members have talked about, are two women who had the bravery and the courage to complain about behaviour that was unacceptable. I say to Parliament honestly that they were let down by the Government. That has been acknowledged by the First Minister, by me on countless occasions, and we accept that criticism and we have apologised for it. But as Dr Alistair Allen has just said, those women were also very badly let down by somebody who was a member of this committee by leaking a misrepresentation of their evidence to a Sunday newspaper. That has added trauma upon trauma to these complainants, and whoever was responsible for that should consider the issues raised by Patrick Harvey in his contribution, because they are unfit to be a member of this Parliament. The Government accepts that mistakes were made. We apologise for them and we will remedy them. There is much in the committee report that was published this morning of substance which is of strong challenge to the procedures and processes of the Government, which the Government must accept. It is good work that has been done there, and as Jackie Baillie has just said, the overwhelming majority of it was delivered unanimously. The Laura Dunlop report that was passed to the Government last week, I have indicated publicly the Government will take forward, along with the Harassment Committee inquiry report and that of Mr Hamilton, to make sure that action is taken speedily to address the issues that need to be addressed, to make sure we have in place a policy framework that is fit for purpose to enable anyone who has the need to complain to be able to complain and to complain with confidence. So those will be the actions of Government, and it will be for incoming ministers to take that forward after the 6th of May. We then turn to the substance of this motion and whether it is an appropriate motion for this Parliament to consider. On the 2nd of March, Douglas Ross MP said this: "There is no longer any doubt that Nicola Sturgeon lied to the Scottish Parliament and broke the ministerial code on numerous counts." That was the day before the First Minister gave 8 hours of testimony, before she had said a word to the Parliamentary Committee. On the same day, Adam Tompkins, a member of this Parliament, tweeted this: "Sturgeon lied. We know that now. That's why she must resign. She lied." Ruth Davidson talked about high standards. I have to say I find that tweet the lowest standard I have ever seen in my parliamentary life. My dear friend, the First Minister, talked about the toxic culture. If there was a toxic culture anywhere, Adam Tompkins emptied a gallon of petrol on that toxic culture by a remark of that type. Jackie Baillie talked a moment ago about how the committee was a dispassionate conclusion was arrived at by the votes of 2 Conservatives, 1 Labour, 1 Liberal and 1 Independent member. On the 12th of October 2020, Murdo Fraser tweeted, "The FM lied again." How on earth can we be expected to take seriously conclusions arrived at by 5 votes to 4 at the last gasp of the committee processes, when the committee had already agreed to these words? For all these reasons, the committee believes that James Hamilton's report is the most appropriate place to address the question of whether or not the First Minister has breached the Scottish Ministerial Code. And yesterday, Mr Hamilton gave his verdict. I am of the opinion that the First Minister did not breach the provisions of the Ministerial Code in respect of any of these matters. So the First Minister, on the committee's test, was exonerated yesterday by Mr Hamilton, and I am delighted that that has been the case. I have sat in close quarters to the First Minister for many years, as colleagues, sometimes in active disagreement about priorities, most of them, respectfully, First Minister, about money, if I seem to remember. But throughout all of my days of dealing with the First Minister, I've always known I was dealing with an individual of integrity, of character, of responsibility and of devotion. Devotion to serving the people of this country. She has given every ounce of her energy to protect the people of this country in the last trying 12 months over COVID. She has done everything she could to protect the public, and the last thing she deserves is this grubby motion from the Conservatives, and I invite Parliament to chuck it out at the first available opportunity.
Thank you, Mr Swinney. And can I ask Liz Smith to wind up our debate?
Thank you. Tomorrow, Presiding Officer, every seat in this Parliament becomes vacant again, and all business in the Chamber comes to an end, after which we await the verdict of the voters on the 6th of May, just 6 weeks away. And as the First Minister said, that is as it should be. But I hope the newly elected members on the 6th of May will learn some very important lessons about what this whole sorry saga has meant for Scottish politics. And I also hope these lessons will be learnt by every single politician, irrespective of his or her political views or seniority, starting with the fact that the female complainants in this case have been utterly failed by the serious flaws in the Scottish Government's handling of the complaints process. But that is not all, because the fallout from both James Hamilton's report and from the Parliamentary Committee investigating the Scottish Government's handling of the complaints process is significant, and it is certain to have long-term ramifications. The First Minister has been cleared of breaking the ministerial code, but she has not been cleared of a serious lack of judgment, of presiding over a dysfunctional government, and crucially, of misleading the committee, most especially when it comes to her account of when she first heard about the concerns of Alex Salmond. Neither should we ignore the fact that James Hamilton makes clear that he was frustrated by the fact that legal constraints prevented him from publishing all the relevant details without redaction, so that the necessary evidence could be examined in the appropriate context. Presiding Officer, when political commentaries are written these days, it is often said, I won't, Mr Swinney, it is often said that politicians have sunk low in people's esteem, that there is a diminished level of integrity in politics and therefore a diminished level of trust between the voter and the body politic. Presiding Officer, I agree with that. And that, for me, is what has happened in this case, because it is symptomatic of the problem. Because at times there has been a complete disregard for the will of Parliament. How many times in recent months have we seen the Scottish Government completely ignore the outcome of votes in this chamber? We have seen a government determined to override the democratic process, believing that it knows better than Parliament. Indeed, that is the main difference that I see in my 14 years in Holyrood. Government is now dominant over Parliament rather than the other way round, and that is not healthy for democracy. And in that context, Mr Swinney, if you're going to make
please, Mr.
comments,
Swinney.
I would be grateful if you could just listen to the next point. Because I hope that the First Minister will reflect on the findings of James Hamilton when he says, and I quote, "Although I accept the First Minister's statement that her motivation to agreeing to the meeting was personal and political, and she may have sought to underscore this by hosting it in her private home and with no permanent civil servant present, and no expenditure of public money, it could not, in my opinion, be characterised as a party meeting." That speaks volumes about the difference between party and government and how we should operate. In a further section in James Hamilton's report, he raises concerns that the claim that one of our officials leaked the name of the complainer is credible, and that must ring alarm bells too. And then there is the vast sum of taxpayers' money spent on a legal case that the First Minister knew was fundamentally flawed. Presiding Officer, this whole issue has principally raised questions about the operations of the First Minister and the Scottish Government, but it has also raised questions about the effectiveness of Holyrood. And to those ministers who in recent weeks have been trying to pretend that this Parliament is above reproach, I say no, it is not. I do not subscribe to the view that Holyrood is broken, but if it is to restore its reputation, it has a lot to think about in the next Parliament, led by the next presiding officer, whoever he or she may be. It needs to address the concerns about the inbuilt political bias of the committee system, about the relationship between government and other important bodies, including the Crown, about the absence of parliamentary privilege and the need to scrutinise post-legislative matters given the absence of a revising chamber. And so we fully support the committee's recommendation that there should be a commission to review the relationship between the executive and the legislature and make recommendations for change. Presiding Officer, I return to my earlier remark that this is all about women who were failed by the Scottish Government. But it's also about the failed workings of government, of the First Minister and her senior officials, and the weakened scrutiny of Parliament, which resulted from obfuscation, from a lack of transparency and incomplete information provided by the Scottish Government. I would suggest that no one comes out of this well, but principally the First Minister, who, although she is cleared of breaking the ministerial code, she has been found guilty of so many other failings which have undermined the integrity of this whole political process. What the person out there in the real world can see is that staff have been bullied, evidence has been withheld, stories don't add up, and women complainants have been badly let down. And so when the political history of 2021 comes to be written, people will rightly ask, why has no one resigned?
Thank you very much, Ms Smith. And that concludes our debate on a motion of no confidence. We're going to go straight to the vote. The question is that motion 24292 in the name of Ruth Davidson on a motion of no confidence be agreed. Are we all agreed? No! We're not agreed. We're going to suspend for 5 minutes to allow members to access the voting app, members in the chamber and members on the virtual chamber. Parliament is suspended for 5 minutes. Thank you, colleagues. We are now back in session and we're going to move straight to the vote. The question is that motion 24292 in the name of Ruth Davidson on a motion of no confidence be agreed. Members should cast their votes now. This will be a 1 minute division. A 1 minute division. Thank you, colleagues. That vote is now closed. Please let me know if you were not able to vote. Can I call Gill Patterson to make a point of order? Gill Patterson to make a point of order.
Thanks very much, Presiding Officer. I was unable to access the app. I would have voted no.
Thank you, Mr Patterson. Your vote will be added to the vote. Thank you. Thank you, colleagues. The result of the vote on motion 24292 in the name of Ruth Davidson is yes 31, no 65. There were 27 abstentions and the motion is therefore not agreed.